Hello everybody, welcome to today's lecture. Today we are going to look at the causes and the beginning of World War II, both in Europe and in the United States. Like our World War I lecture, the causes of World War II are largely not relegated to the United States. They're largely a European affair, but unlike World War I, the United States gets involved in World War II much sooner than they did during the First World War, and of course that has to do with the surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor early in the morning on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. And we will end today's lecture with looking at that and America's entry into the war. But one of the main similarities between World War I and World War II is that as tensions are heating up in Europe, the United States will maintain a stance of neutrality. Remember, in World War I, we were a neutral nation, supposedly, right? Obviously, we were tied to the economy of Europe as we sought to trade with them, and that's also going to be true for the United States here during World War II. One of the big differences, however, is that our president during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, he, I believe, wanted to go to war, but due to pressures by the nation as a whole, he maintained a stance of neutrality. However, by the time December 7th, 1941 comes around, we have really economically devoted ourselves to the Allied cause against the Axis powers. Okay? So to understand how all this happens, I want to spend some time looking at the causes of the war, and we're going to be doing that by looking at the rise of two important people to power, and that would be one, Adolf Hitler, and two, Benito Mussolini. And we're going to begin this lecture by assessing their rise to power, and then we will look at America's response, what the United States was doing while they are rising to power, and then again, as I mentioned before, we'll end with Pearl Harbor. So, with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. It says, the devastation of World War I greatly destabilized Europe, and in many respects, World War II grew out of issues left unresolved by that earlier conflict. Okay, the reality of it is that World War I is cause number one for World War II, and more specifically, it's the Treaty of Versailles. Let's recall back that the Treaty of Versailles severely punished Germany after World War I, and to top things off, Germany was under the impression that they had not in fact lost the war, that they had been somehow victorious, and the Treaty of Versailles sort of dumped salt on an already open festering wound, and it established a lot of bitterness among Germans and other Europeans. And as time went on, the economy in many places in Europe, society in Europe, politics in Europe, they became very rancid, right? And you, on top of those rancid situations, you have this bitterness over the Treaty of Versailles, and so from that you're going to get demagogues. You're going to get people who speak really well, who are passionate, men like Adolf Hitler, who are going to offer an alternative to the major concerns of the day. For example, it says here, in particular, political and economic instability in Germany and lingering resentment over the harsh terms imposed by the Versailles Treaty fueled the rise to power of Hitler and the National Socialist Party, or what we call the Nazi Party. Okay, and then eventually by 1939, the Nazis will invade Poland and start World War II. All right, the circumstances surrounding Hitler's rise to power are very similar in Italy as well, and we will see here in a little while that Benito Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, where he will create a fascist regime, it's very similar to that of Adolf Hitler's. And because these men are similar in that respect, because both men want to see communism go away, because both men want to see democracy go away, because both men are power hungry, right, they will ally together. To round this out, you will also have the Japanese, who will ally with both Italy and Germany. Japan has, by the latter part of the 19th century and throughout the 20th, been imperializing. They have become very militaristic, and the relationship between the United States and Japan has become rather acrid, and ultimately in the end, these three nations, Japan, Italy, and Germany, will establish the Axis powers of World War II. Okay? What I want to do now is I want to look first at Adolf Hitler and figure out exactly how is it that Hitler came to power. Now, at this point in history, when Hitler is rising to power, right, we do not want to impose questions of how on earth could someone follow someone like Hitler, right? Because in the 1920s and 30s, Hitler had not yet enacted war upon the nation. The Holocaust, or what we call the final solution, had not yet been enacted, right? And, you know, as you will see in one of the films that I will ask you to watch, it wasn't clear whether or not Hitler was a good thing with some bad consequences or a bad thing with some good consequences. You simply couldn't tell. And that's quoting word for word the individual whom you will see a little bit later in one of the films. So, with all that said, let's dive into Mr. Adolf Hitler. Alright, it says Hitler's rise to power cannot be attributed to one single event, right? You know, instead, like most things, it was a culmination of things. In fact, it says here, but rather, his rise to power was a mixture of factors, including events happening outside Germany, right? The strength of the Nazi Party, okay? We have to recognize that the Nazis were a political party. At this point in Germany, right after World War I, a republic is established. It's called the Weimar Republic. And much like the United States Republic, there are multiple political parties, okay? The Nazi Party was one political party vying for votes and vying for seats in their parliament. And their parliament in Germany was known as the Reichstag, right? There's a chancellor, there's a president, right? There's a republican system in place. And the Nazis are simply one party, right? And that party is going to grow in prosperity, okay? So you've got events happening outside of Germany, you've got the strengths of the Nazi Party, and you also have the weaknesses of other parties within Germany, right? It says Hitler used these factors to his advantage, and in 1933 he legitimately gained power, and he was named Chancellor of Germany. And once that happens, Hitler will further consolidate his power. He will then create a dictatorship in Germany, and he will enact not only war upon the world, but, and closely linked to it, the Holocaust. Okay? So how does this happen? How exactly did Hitler go from being just a member of the German military to the Chancellor and ultimately dictator of Germany? Let's look at that. Alright, to understand how that happened, we have to go all the way back to World War I. And it says, with the loss of the war, the German monarchy was abolished, right? And a new republic was created from it. Again, the Weimar Republic. It says a constitution was written providing for a president who had broad political and military power, as well as a parliamentary democracy. It says a national election was held to elect 423 deputies to the National Assembly, and the centrist parties swept to victory, and as a result, the Weimar Republic was created. Okay, just giving you some context. You don't necessarily need to know all of that, but just understand that following World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates his throne. Right, the monarchy comes crashing down, and this Weimar Republic is created. It's a centrist party. It says on June 28, 1919, the German government, meaning the Weimar Republic, on June 28, 1919, the Weimar Republic ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is an important thing. It seems a bit inconsequential, but it's not. Okay? The Weimar Republic, in the minds of many Germans, is responsible for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. It was the members of the Weimar Republic who affixed their names to the treaty, who said that they would abide by the treaty. Therefore, in the minds of many Germans, including Hitler, who, by the way, was not German but Austrian, okay? But in the minds of many, including Hitler, the Weimar Republic represented what was wrong with the nation, because they were kin to the Treaty of Versailles, because it was on June 28, 1919, that they signed the treaty. So if you're going to get rid of the treaty, you needed to also get rid of the Weimar Republic and institute a new form of government. Okay? It says, under the terms of the treaty, which ended hostilities in the war, Germany had to pay reparations for all civilian damages, right? Let's also remember that they had to take full responsibility for the war. They lost tons of territory, right? They lost allies. Their military was completely made much smaller than it had previously been. And so the Treaty of Versailles, of course, is a humiliating document that the Weimar Republic accepted. And after the war ends, the economy in Germany and in other places becomes so bad, right? Money's becoming inflated, times are difficult, and the reality is many Germans look to the Weimar Republic as a sort of bunk form of government, a government that is not going to solve the major issues that Germany is facing. Hitler, on the other hand, looks like a good alternative. Okay? All right, let's move on. It says, Germany also lost her colonies and large portions of German territory. Again, sort of restating what I've already said. What is actually created is, it says, a 30-mile strip on the right bank of the Rhine was a demilitarized zone, an area where German military couldn't be. And the reason for this demilitarized zone, this Rhineland as it was called, was to protect France, as I understand it, from German aggression. Right? It says limits were placed on German armaments and the military itself. It says the terms of the treaty were humiliating to most Germans, and condemnation of its terms undermined the government and served as a rallying cry for those who, like Hitler, believed Germany was ultimately destined for greatness. Right? I mean, one of the things that Hitler's definitely going to be mentioning here is that, you know, Germany needs to be a third Reich, a third empire. And one of the things Hitler promised was that he would create a third Reich, which he did. Unfortunately, it didn't last the 1,000 years that Hitler said it would. Okay? But when you're listening to Hitler speak, when you're voting for various political parties, right, one of the things that people begin to do is they begin to adhere to what Hitler is saying. Right? They begin to vote for the Nazis because what they see in the Nazis and what they see in Hitler, at least during the 20s and 1930s, is a political institution that is going to rectify the problems of the Treaty of Versailles. A political institution that is going to fight for the greatness of Germany and to reinstall the values of what it meant to be a great German, right? And so that's why people begin to really rally behind Hitler. He's promising to fix the economy. He's promising to make Germany great. He's promising to correct the problems of the government. He's promising to kick communists out as well as Jews, which at this point, you know, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, a term which means anti-Jew, right, going on in Germany and throughout the world, okay? But Hitler's saying things, doing things, right, that speak to the concerns that Germans have, and they flock to him because he sounds like someone who can make changes for the betterment of Germany. And based upon your perspective, right, he did, right? Again, that's based upon your perspective. He did make things better. The economy got better. The military got stronger. Germany gained more land, right? Okay? He did this in ways that obviously today, I think, historically speaking, we would say were wrong. But, you know, he followed through on what he promised he was going to do. You know, his methods are a bit problematic, okay, to say the least, but he did what he said he was going to do, and this gains him further confidence, okay? All right, moving forward. All right, it says, soon after the war in Munich, Hitler was recruited to join a military intelligence unit and was assigned to keep tabs on a political party known as the German Workers' Party, what would later be referred to as the Nazis. It says, at the time, it was comprised of only a handful of members. It was disorganized, and it had no program, right? Ultimately, the German Workers' Party was a disorganized group of people who were trying to establish some sort of political presence. And really, the person who's going to help organize that party is Hitler. So he shows up, and the one thing that this party has that Hitler likes is this sort of right-wing doctrine, which was consistent with his own. And Hitler's going to give further expression to this political party's doctrine. He's actually going to create sort of a handbook, if you will, of what it meant to be or adhere to Nazi ideology. Hitler saw the German Workers' Party as a vehicle to reach his political ends. His blossoming hatred of the Jews became part of the organization's political platform. And to be fair, there was a lot of people who disliked Jews, and used Jews as scapegoats. Okay, this was even true in the United States, right? Anti-Semitism was rampant. It wasn't relegated just to Germany. Germany just happened to take it to a very extreme later on during the final solution, right? But at this point in time, Hitler's going to give voice, he's going to give organization, he's going to give ideology and structure to this Workers' Party. Okay, let's move forward. Alright, it goes on to state here that Hitler built up the party, again the German Workers' Party, converting it from a de facto discussion group to an actual political entity. It says advertising for the party's meetings appeared in anti-Semitic newspapers. Makes sense. If you're already reading anti-Semitic newspapers, then the anti-Semitic ideologies expressed by the Nazi Party are going to be appealing to you, right? It says the turning point of Hitler's mesmerizing oratorical career, however, occurred at one such meeting, which was held on October 16th, 1919. It says Hitler's emotional delivery of an impromptu speech captivated audiences. I mean, there's a reason why Hitler's called a demigod, right? This is a man who was able to speak, and he was able to speak well. He could bore into your consciousness. He captivated you, right? This is a man who was not only saying things that were appealing, but he was saying them in a way that really grabbed your attention, and it convinced you, right, of what he was espousing. Okay, it says, through word of mouth, donations poured into the party's treasuries, and subsequent mass meetings attracted hundreds of Germans eager to hear the young, forceful, hypnotic leader. Now, I don't want to paint a picture as though every German is, an adherent of the Nazi Party. They're not, right? Even though the Nazi Party is going to become an extremely powerful party, right? I don't think they ever receive more than like 41% of the total vote. So they are an important minority party, but they're not necessarily a party that, is receiving 100% of the vote. Everybody wants to be a Nazi, okay? And I think that's an important thing to remember, because not every German was a Nazi, but every Nazi was a German. And we have to make that distinction, because we don't want to cast judgment, right? And even in a historical inquiry sort of way, we have to look at this period of history through everyone's eyes, both Hitler's and others, to try and understand. And again, understanding does not justify the actions of people, right? But it helps us to better grasp how and why things occurred. Okay? Why are people flocking to Hitler? He's a great orator. He is capitalizing upon the problems of the day, and he's making promises that he will follow through with. Okay? So, with that, again, let's move on. This, of course, is our friend Adolf. In case you had never seen him before, that was Adolf Hitler when he was younger. Obviously, probably in his 20s, I would guess, maybe 30s. But there you have him. Good old Adolf. There you go. Moving forward. All right, it says, as chairman of this new party, Hitler drafted a program or a set of party ideologies consisting of 25 points. And so, when you think about, what is it that a Republican believes in, or a Libertarian, or a Democrat, right? There's a set of party ideas that those political entities follow. Well, that's kind of what Hitler's doing here. He's establishing a platform. He's laying the cornerstone of what the Nazi Party will be. It says, those Jews were the principal target. Hitler called for the abrogation of the Versailles Treaty. He says, hey, we need to get rid of the Versailles Treaty. It is the Versailles Treaty that is causing our humiliation, which is causing our problems. We need to abolish that and destroy it, right? He wants to confiscate war profits. He wants to seize land without compensation for use by the state, right? Hitler is of the opinion that there is not enough Germany for the number of Germans who are living, right? It's what Hitler calls his Lebensraum, which means living space. There's not enough living space for the Germans in Germany. Okay. He also wants to revoke civil rights for Jews, which he will do in 1935 after he basically becomes a dictator of Germany. And he wants to expel those Jews who had immigrated into Germany after the war. Okay. It says, more appealing to the masses were no doubt his promotion of the popular welfare, which means the common weal comes before individual welfare. In other words, one of the things that Hitler espoused, and in fact Mussolini will do this as well, is that the state was more important than the individual. What was good for the individual may not be good for the state. And if that's the case, then you need to sacrifice what's good for your personal life for what is good for the state, right? Okay, what's good for the popular welfare, okay? This would be the right of the establishment of self-determination for all Germans and equal rights for their state. It says his points provided a sense of nationalist pride for Germans who felt degraded by the Weimar Republic, who felt degraded by the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so again, it's not just that Hitler is a great speaker, it's that he is saying things, he's capitalizing upon ideas, he was forwarding ideologies that many Germans liked and then flocked to, right? And he's packaging it up in a nice little bow with his oratorical skills, right? And so when we begin to contemplate how and why certain people would flock to Hitler, we have to bear that in mind, right? That he represented what could be right with Germany. And by all measures, once he gained power, he followed through on that. Now, what he did, of course, wasn't good for every German, right? If you were a German who happened to be a communist, or if you were a German Jew, right, then Hitler's programs did not, bode well for you. But for the general German population, what Hitler would call his Aryan nation, right, his ideologies are not only going to be ideologies, they're going to come to fruition. He's going to come through on them, okay? Okay, let's go on. It says soon after he's sort of forwarding this ideology, this program, it says treatment of Jews was a major theme of Hitler's orations, and the increasing scapegoating of the Jews for inflation, political instability, unemployment, and the humiliation in the war found a willing audience. In other words, Germany, many Germans, including Hitler, began to use the Jews as a scapegoat, right? Why do we have mass inflation? The Jews. Why is there political instability? The Jews. Why did we get humiliated in World War I? The Jews, right? You have to have some type of scapegoat, and the Jews were it for the Nazi Party, okay? It says Jews were tied to internationalism. It says the name of the party was soon changed to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis, and the red flag with the swastika was adopted as the party symbol. And again, this is a rather interesting I'm just losing my mind here. It's an interesting symbol to use because the swastika was an Indian symbol of peace that Hitler simply rotated. I believe there was a change in the way that the swastika was put on the flag, and this once symbol of peace became a symbol of hatred and death, right? I mean, that's what it has become, right? So eventually a local newspaper which appealed to anti-Semites was purchased by the Nazi Party because it was going bankrupt, and of course the Nazis could print and say whatever it was that they wanted to say or print in the pages of that newspaper. And so it wasn't just by word of mouth, it wasn't just by Hitler's orations. The Nazis are also going to be using the press to further their platform. Okay, moving forward. All right, it says in July 1921, Hitler became chairman of the Nazi Party. In January 1923, a major change is going to happen. Okay, something significant. It says in January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into Germany to settle a reparations dispute. Now, of course, what you have here is, the people who are oppressing you economically have now come into your nation, they've come into your state, and they're coming into Germany in order to deal with the reparations that you, Germany, owe. It says Germans resented this occupation, which also had an adverse effect on the economy. It says Hitler's party benefited by the reaction to this development and exploited it by holding mass protest rallies despite a ban on these rallies by the local police, right? In other words, these Belgian and French troops are the enemy in the minds of many Germans, and the reaction of Germans to their presence is negative. And Hitler goes, this is an opportunity to capitalize upon this bitterness, to capitalize upon this energy. And they're holding rallies, they're holding meetings, and they're trying to stir the pot up a bit. It says the Nazi Party began drawing thousands of new members, many of whom were victims of hyperinflation and found comfort in blaming the Jews for their problems. Okay? For an example, when we're talking about hyperinflation, we're talking about a ridiculous amount of hyperinflation. It says the price of an egg, for example, had inflated to 30 million times its original price in just 10 years. Economic upheaval generally breeds political upheaval, and Germany in the 1920s was no exception. I mean, literally, Germans would be taking wheelbarrows full of money and burning it because they needed to stay warm. Their money was worthless. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. An egg rose 30 million times its original price. You couldn't buy anything with your money in Germany, right? And who's to blame for this? It's the Treaty of Versailles, because we have to pay all these reparations. And who's the target of that? The French and the Belgians, because they're the ones we're having to pay reparations to, right? These are probably things that Hitler said, and it brings out emotion in people and draws people in, right? And because Hitler's the face of the Nazi Party, more and more people begin to adhere to its values and ideologies. Okay? All right, let's move forward. Okay, so it states here that the Bavarian government, right, it defied the Weimar Republic, accusing the German government of being too far left. Now, this type of rhetoric was something that Hitler himself would have, in fact, endorsed. And it says here, Hitler endorsed the fall of the Weimar Republic, and he declared at a public rally on October 30th, 1923, that he was prepared to march on Berlin to rid the government of the communists and the Jews, and ultimately to topple the Weimar Republic. Now again, Hitler is gaining thousands of followers, right? He is capitalizing upon an acrid environment. He is capitalizing upon the presence of these Bavarian and French officials, right? And the type of animosity that that is drawing. And so here he is going to say, let's go and essentially have sort of a coup d'etat, if you will, right? A blow of state, an overthrow of the German government, right? So it says on November 8th, 1923, Hitler held a rally at a Munich beer hall and proclaimed revolution, right? And so what's going to follow from this is what we call the beer hall putsch. And this beer hall putsch, it was Hitler's attempt to gain support from various governments, to gain support from numerous Nazis, to essentially topple the Weimar Republic. Moving on. It goes on to say that the following day he led 2,000 armed brown shirts in an attempt to take over the Bavarian government. The small Nazi party first won national attention in the beer hall putsch of November 1923, when the Ruhr crisis and the Great Inflation were at their height. It says Hitler and his Nazis joined with General Erich Ludendorff and his conservative nationalist followers in an attempt to seize power in Munich. So Hitler does have some army, if you will, these brown shirts, and he's got some alliances with Ludendorff, and so they're going to go to power, or I'm sorry, they're going to go to Munich and try to seize control, and you know, ultimately this beer hall putsch will be a failure. Okay, let's move on. It says the plot got its name because it was planned in one of Munich's beer halls. Once they had taken Munich, Hitler and Ludendorff planned to use the Bavarian capital as a base of operations against the Republican government in Berlin. It says the support that Hitler and Ludendorff expected to receive, however, from conservatives within the Bavarian politics, failed to materialize, and the police easily subdued Hitler, Ludendorff, and the Nazis, and threw Hitler into prison. Now, Hitler was tried and convicted. He was supposed to spend 5 years in prison, served 8 months. But while he was there, he wrote his most famous book, Mein Kampf, a book or title which means My Struggle. And the book is very thick, very dense. And so a lot of people want to argue that the book itself outlines Hitler's intention to eradicate the Jews and establish the Holocaust. I don't think that that's the case. But what it does do is it does set forth his ideas about various groups of people, including the Jews. Okay, we have to recognize, however, that the Jews are not the only people that Hitler does not like. He also dislikes very much communists, and he wants to do everything he can to eradicate Germany of both of these threats, as he would call them. Okay? All right, let's move on. All right, it says there were several targets in the book, including Democrats, communists, and internationalists, but of course he reserved the brunt of his attack for the Jews, whom he portrayed as responsible for all of the problems and evils of the world. Right? He says Jews are responsible. In fact, Hitler goes on to say that the Jews were responsible for World War I, that they were responsible for the Weimar Republic, that they were responsible for the poor economy in Germany, right? And he says that Jews are responsible for democracy, for communism, and for internationalism, right? I mean, he's just using the Jews as a scapegoat, as a means to rally people together in many ways, because, of course, many people are anti-Semitic in Germany at this time and in the United States. Okay? It says Jews were the German nation's true enemy, he argued. They had no culture of their own. Instead, he refers to the Jews as parasitic. They're parasites. They leech and suck off the culture of other more prominent groups. He argued this, but I'm sorry. I got tongue-tied here. It says, they had no culture of their own, he asserted, but rather they perverted existing cultures, such as Germany's, with their parasitism. It says, as such, the Jews, he argued, were not a race, but rather they represented an anti-race. Now, what I want you to do is click on the top title here where it says Mein Kampf, and what you're going to get is a 10-minute reading of a portion of Hitler's Mein Kampf. I would encourage you to listen to maybe only the first 3 to 4 minutes of it, and within those 3 to 4 minutes, you're going to hear Hitler. You're not going to hear his voice, which obviously so in reading the book. You're going to hear Hitler speak about the Jews being sort of this anti-race, that they are parasitic, right? So just sort of get a flavor of what it is that Hitler was actually saying. Okay, so go ahead and click on that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, hopefully you had an opportunity now to listen to the reading of Mein Kampf. If not, please go back and listen to that. But let's move forward. It says, once released from prison, Hitler decided to seize power constitutionally rather than by force of arms. Okay, remember, Hitler's Nazi party is one party among many, right? And he has to vie for control and vie for power. Now, Hitler lost some of his popularity once he went into prison, but he quickly gained it back. It says, using demagogic oratory, Hitler spoke to scores of mass audiences, calling for the German people to resist the yoke of Jews and communists and to create a new empire, what Hitler called the Third Reich. Okay, and he argued that this Third Reich would rule the world for 1,000 years. Okay, and so again, Hitler is really making claims and capitalizing upon an environment that is ready to topple the Weimar Republic, that is ready to topple the Versailles Treaty, right? And Hitler is very persuasive, okay? And so he's going to quickly be able to move back into the ranks of the Nazi Party, and he's going to become so powerful, so popular within the Nazi Party, and the Nazis themselves will become so popular that members of the Weimar Republic, including a man by the name of Hindenburg, who is the president, as well as von Papen, someone who will become vice chancellor. These individuals believe that they must work with Hitler because he's too popular. Not to work with him, to shun him, could result in political problems. And so, again, Hitler's rise to power after he gets out of prison is done constitutionally. The people will place him into authority. Okay? All right, let's move on. Alright, it says that the Nazis gradually devised an electoral strategy to win northern farmers and white-collar voters in small towns, which produced a landslide electoral victory in September of 1930. Now, the Nazi Party is going to gain a significant percentage of the vote. It says about 18% of the votes cast in September 1930 went to the Nazi Party, which was an increase from 3% to 18%, right? It says eventually, as time goes on, that number is going to increase, and then by 1932 it will decrease, it will dip just a little bit. Okay, now during all this process, Hitler is going to run for the presidency. He will fail. Okay, and the individual who becomes president is a man by the name of Paul von Hindenburg. Now, Hindenburg does not trust Hitler, albeit Hindenburg, with the egging of other individuals, believes that, again, he has to work with Hitler. Hitler is too much of a figure, public figure. The Nazis, even though they had lost some percentage of their vote in the 32 elections, were still a formidable political entity that they felt that they needed to work with. And so the result of this feeling the need to work with Hitler will result in Hitler being named the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Once Hitler becomes Chancellor, he will then consolidate his power by acquiring the majority of the seats in their parliament. Again, it's known as the Reichstag. And then once he solidifies his power that way, he essentially creates a dictatorship. Okay, let's move forward. It says, after a bigger landslide in July 1932, 44%, their vote declined and their movement began to weaken. Hitler lost the presidential election to World War I veteran Paul von Hindenburg in April, and then the elections of November 1932, they received roughly 42% of the vote. So their popularity decreases a bit, but we're still talking about a very significant minority. So what happens here is Hitler decided to enter a coalition government as Chancellor in January 1933. Now the question is, how and why did Hitler become Chancellor? Again, I've already alluded to that. There was this feeling, a need to work with him and the Nazis. But to delineate that story a little bit more, go ahead and click on that link, how and why did Hitler become Chancellor, and there's a short video there that's going to talk briefly about how and why Hitler became Chancellor, and then go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, so Hitler becomes Chancellor in 1933, an incredibly significant event in world history. It says the Nazis won their support primarily from the lower middle class and the peasantry. It says these voters were strongly nationalistic, and the Nazis were purporting a sort of nationalistic platform, right? And they feared that the Depression would deprive them of their standard of living. And of course, Hitler was proclaiming that he could strengthen the economy, right? It says in religion, most of the Nazis' supporters were Protestants. German Catholics remained firm in their support of the Catholic Center Party. Okay, albeit what we do know is that the Nazis did have some influence from the Catholics. There are some historians who contend that there was a strong relationship between Hitler and the Pope at the time. In fact, there's a work out called Hitler's Pope, which talks briefly, or not briefly, but speaks of that relationship and among other things. So, you know, if you're interested in the role of religion and its impact upon the Nazis and how the Nazis used religion, you might want to begin with that particular work, Hitler's Pope. Okay. Otherwise, by this point, there's some strong support for the Nazis. Hitler is Chancellor. It's 1933, and things are about to drastically change in Germany. It says, after becoming Reich Chancellor in 1933, Hitler swiftly consolidated power, right? And the way that he does this, again, is he is able to acquire significant numbers of seats within the Reichstag. There was an election in 1933 for seats in the Reichstag, and running for these seats were communists and Nazis. And the night before the election was to happen, the Reichstag building, you know, what we would look at as our Capitol building, it explodes. And the Nazis immediately blame the communists, that they were at fault for blowing up the building, right? And of course, what we know today is that this was not the case. The Nazis were in fact the one who blew up the Reichstag building, but they did this because they were then able to blame the communists, and people fearing the communists even more so during the election decided to go ahead and vote in for the Nazis, and the Nazis take a significant portion of the Reichstag seats, and this allows Hitler and the Nazis to just overwhelm the state, and eventually in 1934 Hitler will anoint himself supreme leader of Germany, what they called Das Führer. Okay, it says obsessed with the idea of the superiority of the pure German race, what he called Aryan. Hitler believed that war was the only way to gain the necessary Lebensraum, or living space, for that race to expand. And one of the things that Hitler's definitely going to do during World War II is to try and create an Aryan race, a race of Germans that was pure, that was not tainted, quote unquote, tainted by other minority groups, specifically the Jews, but others as well. Okay, said in the mid-1930s he began the rearmament of Germany, and this of course violated the Treaty of Versailles. And time again Hitler will defy the Treaty of Versailles, not only by rearming the nation, but by using that military to conquer other countries. Of course, this too violated the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's how Hitler comes to power. All right, now he's not the only significant player in World War II. Okay, we also have to understand that Hitler has some alliances that go on. One with Japan, and basically Japan has become an imperialistic, militaristic power. It has been since the latter part of the 19th century, invading various nations, Russia, China, Mongolia, right? And then, as World War II begins, they begin to move towards Southeast Asia. Hitler will eventually make an alliance with Japan, but he will also make an alliance with Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist leader in Italy. And so I want to briefly now speak about Mussolini's rise to power, and then we can briefly talk about what was the United States doing while all this was going on. Okay, so let's take a look at Italy real quick. Okay, it says Mussolini's rise to power began after he returned from World War I. Now, both Mussolini and Hitler were veterans of World War I, but Mussolini gains power in Italy much sooner than Hitler gains power in Germany. It says, again, rising inflation and unemployment caused many Italians to doubt the usefulness of their democratic government, and many turned to Mussolini, who proclaimed that he could restore the economy and build a strong military, right? And one of the ways that Mussolini goes about forwarding his ideologies is he creates a party known as the Fascist Party, and he does this in 1919. And the Fascist Party in Italy is really the only successful example of a fascist government that we could really point to. Fascism is an interesting and a rather difficult type of government to define. And so what I want to do here real quick is just sort of give you some ideas of what a fascist government would be like. Okay, it says, though fascism has no set theory, it does have a set of ideas that it rests upon. There are certain ideologies that it would forward. Okay, central to fascism is this idea of nationalism. Okay, we talked briefly about this with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, right? That one of the parts of the Nazi program was that the state, what is good for the state is what's most important, right? Even if it's not good for the individual, it must benefit the state. Okay, that's very true about fascism, right? There's this strong sense of nationalism, and Italy is what is important. What we do for the good of Italy. Okay, so that's one component of fascism, right? There's loyalty to that state and an authoritarian leader, and of course in this particular situation we're talking about Mussolini. Okay, that your loyalty is to him. He is your leader, right? He is in many respects the figurehead, what your country is about, right? And you have respect and dedication to that particular person, right? Generally in a fascist regime there's only one party, one group of ideas, and here in this case it's the Fascist Party. In Germany it was the Nazis, right? And then they saw the state as supreme and thought each class had a proper place and function. Okay, now I want to read to you a couple things from a book called The Anatomy of Fascism, written by Robert Paxton. And Robert Paxton writes a book with the direct attempt to define and understand what fascism is. And towards the end of the book, he writes the following. He says, "The moment has come to give fascism a usable short handle, even though we know that it encompasses its subject no better than a snapshot encompasses a person." In other words, the definition he's about to provide you, which is a very long-winded definition, right? This definition doesn't really fully encompass what fascism is, but to try and understand it, to try and get our minds wrapped around it, this is what he says. He says, "Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion." Okay? Now, if you want to hear that again, start this slide over and you can hear that again. But the definition is very encompassing. It has to deal with the fact that fascists are extremely nationalistic. They are bent on internal improvements, internal development, external expansion, and they have no problem using violence and to be militant to expand their ideologies. Okay? And this is the type of environment that Mussolini creates in Italy. Now, how exactly does he do that? Well, to a degree, sort of like Hitler, right? The existing government at the time will place him into power, only to then have Mussolini essentially take control as a dictator. Let's move on. It says that as the economy got worse, Mussolini gained widespread popularity among the middle classes, the aristocracy, and industrial leaders. So much so that the support that they provided gave Mussolini the ability to start acting in ways that will eventually allow him to gain control over Italy. It says he came to criticize the standing government, and he used terror to weaken his opponents. And the individuals that he used were called black shirts, right? It says using his black shirts, Mussolini used violence to coerce people into his party, and he used scare tactics to gain political power. Okay? Now, when we're done with this slide, click on the word black shirts there, and it will give you a very short video delineating who these black shirts were, and talk a little bit about them. But before you do that, let's finish this out. It says, in October 1922, 30,000 fascists, along with the black shirts, marched into Rome and demanded that the king put Mussolini in charge of the government. It says, while the king feared Mussolini, he saw his political appointment as the only way for the king to secure his own power. Thus, by 1922, Mussolini had legally gained political power. Yeah, he used the black shirts, he used coercion, he manipulated the existing environment, such as the depression and the poor economy, right, to gain support. Like Hitler, Mussolini was a demagogue. He was a great orator. He could speak well, right? All of this ultimately brings Mussolini into power, and fascism will mount in Italy. Okay. Now, with that, go ahead and click on the link there that says black shirts. Watch that, and then move on to the next slide. Okay, it says, known as Il Duce, or the leader, similar to Hitler's Führer. It says Mussolini soon abolished democracy, right, much as Hitler had done, or will do. It says he made the fascist party the only political entity, and he began to censor and jail any ideas or people who opposed him. And Hitler did this too once he came into power. They had book burnings, for example, where they would, if there was things written by Jews or materials or information that opposed Nazi ideology, they would burn those books. Well, Mussolini was no different, right? Censoring ideas, right? It says, in an attempt to glorify Italy, he promised the people that he would return Italy to the glory of the Roman Empire and in effect create a second Roman Empire. Okay, again, similar to Hitler's argument of a 1,000-year reign Third Reich, right? I mean, both these men are arguing the same thing, that they're going to create these great empires and they're going to last forever and they're going to restore glory to the state. Okay, it says, so popular was Mussolini that by 1925 he had dictatorial powers over Italy and would begin a campaign to extend this new empire into Ethiopia, and he invades Ethiopia in 1935. Okay, and so a bit more quickly, but this is the role that Mussolini takes to gain to power. Now, ultimately, Mussolini, like Hitler, fails, right? The Axis powers will fail in World War II, and to be even more fair, Mussolini's power actually gets removed from him by 1943, when the Allied forces invade Sicily and Italy and depose him. Mussolini, in fact, will have his power stripped from him, and unfortunately, I guess it was for the United States and the Allied powers, eventually Hitler's able to go back into Germany and restore Mussolini to power, but only for a short period of time, because by the time the war ends, Mussolini will be humiliated. He actually attempts to flee Italy dressed as a woman. He gets caught and he gets hung from a gas station. The ultimate disgrace, right? So ultimately, in the end, Mussolini goes down the drain just as Hitler will do. But I guess by 1935, things are looking up for him and for Italy and his fascist nation. So at this point, what we have are Mussolini's in power by 1935. Hitler is in power by 1935. Both men are beginning to implement their policies and their ideas in their respective nations, right? And eventually there will be an alliance between these two nations and Japan, and collectively Japan, Italy, and Germany will create the Axis powers of World War II. Okay. Now, with all that said, let's now look at what was the United States doing while these men were gaining power in their respective nations. So let's take a look at that. Oh, first, please click on the date 1935 there at the end. Watch that short little film. It talks briefly about Mussolini and compares him to Hitler a little bit, and then move on to the next slide. All right, here we go. All right, I got slightly a little bit ahead of myself, but that's okay. Let's pull back just a second. Before we look at what the United States was doing, let me make a couple of comments about what Italy and Germany are going to be doing. Okay, it says on November 1st, 1936, Germany and Italy, reflecting their common interest in destabilizing the European order, announced a Rome-Berlin axis 1 week after signing a treaty of friendship between the two nations. It says nearly a month later, on November 25th, 1936, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan signed the so-called Anti-Comintern Pact, directed at the Soviet Union. Italy then would join the Anti-Comintern Pact on November 6th, 1937, so almost a year later. Okay, the reason why I'm bringing this up is so that you get a sense of what the alliances are and how the Axis power is being built. Okay, it says on May 22nd, 1939, Germany and Italy signed the so-called Pact of Steel, formalizing the Axis alliance with military provisions. And then finally, on September 27th, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, which became known as the Axis Alliance. Now, it's important to understand that when Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, World War II had actually been going on for about a year, okay? Which means that these three nations were quasi-allies for about the first year of the war, and then on September 27, 1940, they were absolutely allies. Okay, that's very oversimplified, but hopefully this gives you a sense of just how the Axis powers were developed. Okay, move on. Let's move on again. Important, however, it says, even before the Tripartite Pact, two of the three Axis powers had initiated conflicts that would become theaters of war in World War II. Okay, one would be Japan. Japan actually opens up World War II, and they start it, if you will, on July 7th, 1937, when Japan invaded China, which initiated the war in the Pacific. Okay, and the Japanese invasion of China was horrific. The way that they treated their victims was horrifying. One of the books that you can read, which would discuss some of the horrific things that the Japanese did, was a book called The Rape of Nanking. And it's referred to as the Forgotten Holocaust or the Pacific Holocaust, right? Just sort of the horrific treatment of the Japanese and the way that they treated people. But Japan, even before they signed the Tripartite Pact, they sort of opened up a theater of war in 1937 by invading China. And then Hitler invades Poland on September 1st in 1939, and this would open up the Western theater in Europe. Okay, it says this unleashed the European War. Italy entered World War II on the Axis side on June 10th, 1940, as the defeat of France became apparent. By June 10th, 1940, France was essentially under control of Germany. Germany had conquered most of France. There was a portion of France in the southern portion known as Vichy France, which had not been controlled or taken over, but for the most part it fell. And so, again, then in September of 1940, you finally get the total Axis power between these three nations. Now, generally speaking, we put the beginning date of World War II as September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Germany. When Hitler invaded Poland. But again, it's important to recognize that Japan had sort of opened up the Pacific theater by invading China in 1937. Okay, let's move forward. Okay. It says, after signing alliances with Italy and Japan against the Soviet Union, Hitler then sent troops to occupy Austria, which he did in 1938. He wasn't supposed to do that per the Treaty of Versailles. And then the following year, he annexed Czechoslovakia. Also not supposed to do this per the Treaty of Versailles. It says Hitler's open aggression went unchecked as the United States and Soviet Union were concentrated on internal politics at the time, and neither France nor Britain were eager to confront Hitler militaristically. In other words, what I'm trying to get at here is that after Hitler and Mussolini gained power in their respective states, from 1936 to 1939, those nations will not only invade other nations, but they will defy the Treaty of Versailles, and specifically this is concerning Hitler, as Hitler will build up his military, as Hitler will invade neighboring countries, okay? And as these men are doing this, nobody is checking them. Nobody is doing anything to stop or halt them, right? Hitler is able to make an Anschluss, or what we call a friendship, with Austria in 1938, right? No one does anything about that, right? Hitler then takes portions of the Sudetenland and then all of Czechoslovakia, and no one does anything really to stop him. All they do is appease Hitler time and time again. And I think the message that Hitler gets here is, I can do whatever I want, no one's going to stop me or do anything, okay? And then September 1939 rolls around, and Hitler is going to invade Poland. Now, Britain and France had both told Hitler that if he were to invade Poland, they would come to the aid of Poland militaristically. Well, Hitler didn't believe them, right? Up to this point, no one had done anything to stop him militaristically, and so Hitler, of course, invades Poland September 1939. And to, I guess, Hitler's surprise, Britain and France did mobilize troops. Unfortunately, the British and French troops didn't get to Poland fast enough, and Poland will actually fall to Germany and Russia. I'll talk about that here in a second. But during this whole time, he's just being appeased, one thing after the next. One of the things I want you to watch here is a speech given by Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England during this period. And Neville Chamberlain gives this speech where he says that we will have peace in our time. Okay, I'm working with Hitler. Hitler promises he's not going to conquer any other nation. Okay, specifically this peace in our time speech is referring to Czechoslovakia. Hitler had taken over portions of Czechoslovakia, and basically before war could happen, there was a meeting that took place, and Great Britain and others said, okay, Hitler, you can have this portion of Czechoslovakia, but just promise not to take anything else, promise to work with us. And of course Hitler says, yeah, sure, whatever you want, totally with the intention of violating any agreement. But nonetheless, go ahead and click on that and listen to what Chamberlain has to say about Hitler, okay, at this time. Once you're done with that, go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, it says in late August 1939, and this is right before September. Remember, September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. But right before he does that, Hitler makes an agreement with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet leader's name is Joseph Stalin. Eventually, the United States and Great Britain will become allies with Joseph Stalin because Hitler actually invades the Soviet Union, and I am convinced that Hitler always intended to invade the Soviet Union, but Hitler is a strategist. Hitler is smart. And one of the things that Hitler must understand is that both Germany and the Soviet Union have made claims on Poland. If Hitler invades Poland, as he intends to do, and in fact will do, right? If Hitler invades Poland without having some type of an alliance with the Soviet Union, then Hitler is going to have to fight a war on two fronts, one against France and Britain and one against Russia. Well, Hitler doesn't want to fight a war on two fronts just yet. He's not ready to have to go to war with the Soviet Union. So what he does in late August 1939 is Hitler and Joseph Stalin signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which incited a frenzy of worry in London and Paris, right? Because this entire time, Hitler's actually been signing pacts with Japan and Italy against the Soviet Union, right? Throughout all of his speeches, right? Hitler repeatedly talks about the evil and the threat of communism, and yet Joseph Stalin is the leader of a communist nation. So, of course, the fact that Hitler is making this alliance is going to be troubling to some folk, okay? It says, Hitler had long planned an invasion of Poland, a nation to which Great Britain and France had guaranteed military support if it was attacked by Germany. And so again, in order to not have to fight a war on two fronts, at least yet, he makes this alliance with Russia. And in fact, this alliance helps Germany to conquer Poland, because when Germany invaded Poland from the west, Russia invaded them from the east. It says the pact with Stalin meant that Hitler would not face a war on two fronts once he invaded Poland, and he would have Soviet assistance in conquering and dividing the nation itself. Thus, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and thus we have World War II, okay, and war begins. So this is how the war begins in Europe, all right? So hopefully by this point we have a good sense of how that happens. Now, what is the United States doing during all this? Really, they're not doing a whole lot. They're being isolationists, which is really something that we had done all along, especially during World War I. You'll recall this was not our conflict. This wasn't a war that we had to fight. We were going to be isolationists. So this is also going to be true for the United States at the start of World War II. Okay, it says, during the 1930s, the combination of the Great Depression and the memory of tragic losses in World War I contributed to pushing American public opinion and policy toward isolationism. In other words, we have our own problems to deal with, right? The Great Depression is wreaking havoc upon the nation, right? And we need to be concerning ourselves with that. Plus, we remember all of these dead and wounded men from World War I, right? So we're just going to isolate ourselves from other issues going on in the world, okay? It says, isolationists advocated non-involvement in European and Asian conflicts and non-entanglement in international politics. In other words, don't get involved in the political issues of the day in Asia and Europe. So as Japan is invading China, the United States says it's not a problem, right? As Hitler is building up his military and gaining power, it's not our problem, right? As these men begin to conquer various nations, whether it's Ethiopia or the Czechoslovakia, the United States says this is not our concern. It says, although the United States took measures to avoid political and military conflicts across the oceans, it continued to expand economically and to protect its interest in Latin America. So again, much like World War I, where you see we have economic ties to Europe, so it was in World War II. And so, in this regard, we are not fully isolationists, just like we weren't in World War I. But I'd also like to point out that the president during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I think is a man who wanted to get involved in World War II. But the tenor of the nation was isolationism, and so he sort of had to go along with that. Okay. All right, let's move on. All right. One of the things we have to remember is that there were actually a couple presidents who sat in the White House during the rise to power of both Mussolini and Hitler. And Herbert Hoover maintained an isolationist position. And in fact, we had passed certain legislation, pieces of policy where, we would condemn certain actions, but we weren't going to commit ourselves to actually acting on those things, okay? But FDR is truly the World War II president, so I want to focus more on him. It says, upon taking office, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tended to see a necessity for the United States to participate more actively in international affairs, much more than Herbert Hoover had done. It says, but his ability to apply his personal outlook to foreign policy was limited by the strength of isolationist sentiment in the United States Congress. Okay, as I mentioned before, there's this sort of general sense of isolationism going on. I think Franklin Roosevelt wants to get involved, but he has to cave to a degree to pressures from the government, right? And from the general population. It says, this did not stop him, however, from trying. For example, in 1933, President Roosevelt proposed a congressional measure that would have granted him the right to consult with other nations to place pressure on aggressors in international conflicts. In other words, this was Roosevelt's attempt to try and apply pressure to European issues, to European problems, to the rise of Hitler and others, right? Didn't necessarily coalesce, but again, this is an example of the way in which Roosevelt sort of is approaching internationalism, the way that he wants to deal with foreign policy. Roosevelt wants a much more active role in the affairs of other nations. The Congress and others don't. Okay, and so the United States will remain quasi-isolated from the events unraveling in Asia and Europe. It goes on to state here that as tensions rose in Europe over Nazi Germany's aggressive maneuvers, Congress pushed through a series of neutrality acts. And when we get done with this slide, go ahead and click on that. It's going to take you to a web page where you can read through some of those neutrality acts. It's kind of important to know what those are about. But the neutrality acts broadly serve to prevent American ships and citizens from becoming entangled in outside conflicts. Remember World War I, right? We were trying to remain neutral, but what kept happening? People were getting blown up by German U-boats. And so what the United States does is it's actually going to pass these neutrality acts to make quite clear that the United States will remain neutral, to make quite clear what the United States position is. It says, Roosevelt lamented the restrictive nature of the acts, but because he still required congressional support for his domestic New Deal policies, he reluctantly acquiesced to the neutrality acts, right? We have to remember that Roosevelt is actually juggling various things here, right? On one hand, he's trying to get pushed through Congress New Deal legislation, right? And he's trying to deal with the Depression. But at the same time, he also wants to do a little bit more in Europe and Asia to address what he clearly sees as some aggressive measures by Germany, right? But the United States, no, we're not going to do that. And the neutrality acts are a representation of this isolationist perspective, okay? So go ahead and click on that, read through some of those neutrality acts, or at least get a sense of what they were and how many of them there were, okay? Because again, the neutrality acts is an example of America's position before the attack of Pearl Harbor, right? After Pearl Harbor, all bets are off, we're going to war. But before, the neutrality acts would be an example of our position. All right, moving on. All right, it says, Roosevelt appeared to accept the strength of the isolationist elements in Congress until 1937. It says, in that year, as the situation in Europe continued to grow worse and the Second Sino-Japanese War began in Asia, the president gave a speech in which he likened international aggression to a disease that other nations must work to quarantine. Okay, makes sense, right? Roosevelt saying, look, we can be isolationists, we can pass these neutrality acts, we can do all these things, but the problems of Asia and the problems of Europe, these are like a black plague that for a moment it has to cross the sea to get to you and you feel safe, but eventually it will cross that sea. And so what Roosevelt wants, of course, to do in making this argument is we as the United States need to be prepared. We need to start getting involved, because if we don't do something now, we could end up becoming the victims of this disease. We must quarantine it before it becomes a major epidemic. And so again, I think this is further evidence of Roosevelt's desire to get involved, but there's still going to be some pressure against him. Okay, moving on. It says, at that time, however, Americans were still not prepared to risk their lives and livelihoods for peace abroad. It says, even the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939 did not suddenly diffuse popular desire to avoid international entanglements. Instead, public opinion shifted from favoring complete neutrality to supporting limited U.S. aid to the Allies short of actual intervention in the war. In other words, by 1939, when war erupts, Americans begin to shift their opinions slightly towards more intervention. And the way that they did this was we passed something called the Lend-Lease Act. Okay? And the Lend-Lease Act by 1939 is evidence that the United States is getting more entangled in the war, right? What Lend-Lease is we are going to send ships, guns, planes, tanks, okay? We're going to build wartime commodities, and we will lend and lease them to the Allied powers. Now, we are not going to send troops, right? No boots will touch the ground, but we will send these goods to Allied nations and allies of the Allied nations, okay? Anywhere where the fascist regime or the Nazis try to invade, so we will send commodities there. Now, I think it's important to note that Lend-Lease actually begins to put a crack or a dent into the Great Depression, because at this point what you're doing is you are mobilizing for war without actually going to war, and that's good for the economy, okay? But Lend-Lease Act is an example of America's move closer to war, because we've clearly chosen a side. We are siding with the Allies. We are militaristically involved in that we are building wartime goods, boats, planes, guns, right? And sending them to the Allies. The only thing we hadn't done yet was to send troops in, right? And of course that will change when finally we are attacked at Pearl Harbor. So click on that link there. It will take you to a film. You're going to want to know about Lend-Lease, so watch the film, and it will show you a bit of what Lend-Lease was and what it did. All right, moving on. Okay, now we get to the main event as far as the United States is concerned for why it entered World War II, right? Now, again, remember, World War II had already been going on since September of 1939. We get attacked by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941. So the war's been going on for a couple years by the time the United States gets involved. By that point, France had fallen to Germany. Germany had attempted to bomb to smithereens Great Britain, known as the Battle of Great Britain. They were unsuccessful in that. And by the time we get involved, Hitler has already invaded the Soviet Union. Okay, but it took being attacked at Pearl Harbor for the U.S. to finally become militaristically engaged. It says the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise, but Japan and the U.S. had been edging toward war for decades. It says the United States was particularly unhappy with Japan's increasingly belligerent attitude in China. The Japanese government believed that the only way to solve its economic and demographic problems was to expand. Okay, in fact, Hitler sort of had that point of view, and they did so by expanding into its neighbor's territory, and they did take over its import market. To this end, Japan had declared war on China in 1937. Remember, we mentioned that, right? They feel a need to expand, they feel a need for their markets to increase, and so they conquer and move into China, right? And the United States views this as a belligerent act, right? and they are going to they're going to begin to develop sour relationships with Japan over their belligerent attitudes and actions in China. Okay, let's move on. It goes on to state that American officials responded to this aggression with a battery of economic sanctions and trade embargoes. Okay, what I'm attempting to do here is to try and explain why Japan would have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. I think it's one of the questions that isn't generally ever answered. Right? It wasn't as if Japan just woke up one morning and decided they were going to bomb the United States. Right? It was rooted in a long history of poor relationships between the United States and Japan, right? Because the United States views Japan as a belligerent, aggressive nation. And one of the ways that the United States attempts to address that, aside from sending military in to stop them, right? One of the ways that we address that is to economically sanction them and to embargo them. The United States reasoned that without access to money and goods, and especially essential supplies like oil, Japan would have to rein in its expansionism. Instead, the sanctions made the Japanese more determined to stand their ground. It says during months of negotiations between Tokyo and DC, neither side would budge, and it seemed that war was inevitable. Okay, the reality is the United States was embargoing things from them. Right, we were freezing assets that the Japanese had in the United States, and our hope was again that that would slow down their expansionism, but it only irritated the Japanese even more. Moving on. So, in retaliation, it says the Japanese plan was simple. Destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That way, the Americans would not be able to fight back as Japan's armed forces spread across the South Pacific. Okay? Thus, on December 7th, after months of planning and practice, the Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. It says at about 8 a.m., Japanese planes filled the sky over Pearl Harbor. Bombs and bullets rained onto the vessels anchored below. At 8:10, an 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona and landed in her forward ammunition magazine and sunk the ship. Now today you can still go and see the Arizona, and I actually have a picture of the memorial in this lecture. But they never got the men out, unfortunately. It's a tomb, and it's now a memorial to the Pearl Harbor incident, right? Now, the Arizona is not the only ship to have been damaged or destroyed. There were others, and again, I've got a map of it in this lecture as well. But it was a surprise attack. You know, I mean, there's some people who will say that Franklin Roosevelt knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen when it was going to happen, and I don't think that's true. I think Roosevelt, like others, probably knew that something was going to happen at some point. What that would look like, I don't think anyone knew. But what Pearl Harbor definitely does is it gives Franklin Roosevelt now the excuse to ask for a declaration of war and to get involved. Alright, it says the USS Arizona exploded and sank with more than 1,000 men trapped inside. Next, torpedoes pierced the shell of the battleship USS Oklahoma. With 400 sailors aboard, the Oklahoma lost her balance, rolled onto her side, and slipped underwater. And then it goes, by the time the attack was over, every battleship in Pearl Harbor, and you can see them listed there, had sustained some significant damage. It said, however, all but the USS Arizona and USS Utah were eventually salvaged and repaired. The others were not. Okay, but this was a major crippling defeat for the United States. The only thing that was good about it was that on December 6th, 1941, the United States had sent out all its aircraft carriers from Pearl. Had those been in Pearl when the attack hit, that would have been even more devastating. Okay, moving on. All right, here you can sort of see where the ships were lined up, and they give you the color coordination, so you can see those which are in red here were sunk, and again, only 2 were unable to be brought back, the Arizona and the Utah. And the Arizona is on the top right, the Utah is in the middle left, and then you can see what the other colors delineate there. But this is sort of what it looks like. Now, in addition to our ships, we also had many planes that were destroyed. The planes were actually parked wing to wing, made a very easy target for the Japanese just to blow them up. So, incredibly horrific event. It says, in all, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor crippled or destroyed 18 American ships and nearly 300 airplanes. Dry docks and airfields were likewise destroyed. Most important, almost 2,500 men were killed and another 1,000 were wounded. It says on December 8th, Congress approved Roosevelt's declaration of war. 3 days later, Japanese allies, Germany and Italy declared war against the United States. It says for the second time, Congress reciprocated. More than 2 years after the start of the conflict, the United States had now entered the conflict. Now, what I want you to do is just to click on that thing. It says film. What you're going to hear is Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress following the attack on Pearl Harbor, and basically his request for war. Okay. All right. Following this slide is a series of pictures showing you what Pearl Harbor looked like at the time and the memorial today. So when you get done watching that, just quickly glance at those photos so you can get a sense of what it was like. Otherwise, that's in a nutshell and very quickly the causes of World War II, both in Europe and Asia, and for the United States to get involved. So with that, go in peace, be warm and filled, and may the force be with you.